The Moira Deeming saga has turned into even more of a train wreck. Not only has John Pesutto, the former Liberal Party leader in Victoria, lost the defamation case, but now various other former leaders have been dragged into potentially having to pay his costs. This is just a slow-moving train wreck combined with a trash fire. It's a terrible outcome for all involved. Perhaps all other than Moira Deeming, of course, but surely this is a saga that could have been avoided. So let's have a look into this, and if you've got any thoughts about it, well, let me know that in the comments below. Now, Moira Deeming, of course, is in the Liberal Party in Victoria. She had been speaking at a women's rights rally. That rally was gate-crashed by a group of neo-Nazis, who seemingly had no affiliation whatsoever with anyone else at the rally, or, importantly, with Moira Deeming. However, John Pesutto seemingly failed to make the distinction between the people who were at the rally for women's rights and people who were at the rally just to gate-crash it. He seemed to believe that the gate-crashers were somehow associated with the rally and anyone who was speaking at it. That, of course, was a false assumption, and then he seemingly besmirched Moira Deeming by insinuating that she herself either was a neo-Nazi or a sympathizer of neo-Nazis, or at least was speaking at a rally that was attended by neo-Nazis who were supposed to be there. The insinuation was obvious, and Moira Deeming subsequently sued for defamation. Now, John Pesutto could have settled this case with an apology and paying $90,000 worth of damages. That would have been an easy outcome. And a pro tip if anyone is ever sued for defamation, often an apology, even a half-hearted one, is the best way to get around this. John Pesutto could have said, "I apologise to Moira Deeming for any insinuation that she happened to be a neo-Nazi or a sympathiser of neo-Nazis. I do not believe that she is a neo-Nazi or she holds neo-Nazi beliefs. I apologise for any hurt or distress caused. I look forward to working with Moira Deeming going forward to hold the Labour Party to account." He could have said something simple like that, where he didn't even really acknowledge wrongdoing, but kind of just walked back prior rhetoric. But he didn't do so, which tells us that often pride can cost you a lot of money. Often it's easier to try to come up to a conciliatory outcome, even if you happen to believe that you're correct. But in this case, it appears that John Pesutto was not even correct to begin with. Now, John Pesutto was hit with a damages order and a costs order. The cost order is absolutely massive because the legal expenses have run into the millions, which again is a signal that if you're ever sued for defamation or you're thinking of doing so, well, really consider your position very carefully, because the money, the time, the cost, and the stress involved in these cases is massive. John Pesutto could have avoided all of that, but he just went down the case of going to court. And in any case, he was hit with a massive cost order going into the millions. John Pesutto is now facing the risk of bankruptcy, which, aside from being terrible financially, would mean that he'd have to leave Parliament in Victoria because you can't be a bankrupt and in Parliament, which would trigger a by-election in Hawthorn. Now, this has given rise to a bit of a fundraising campaign to try to pay his legal bills. However, there's a lot of consternation about this, because many people are not exactly thrilled with footing the bill for a legal case that could have easily been avoided. Not least amongst which are Liberal Party members who would rather the money be spent on almost literally anything else than a case that didn't actually need to go to court. But not only that, Moira Deeming has now sued various other backers of John Pesutto's case. The basic issue here is that if someone is financially backing a case and they have an interest in the outcome of it, they might be held liable for the costs associated with that case. Now again, there's a lot of nuance here. So say for example you go out and you take a loan from a bank to finance your case. Well, in that case, the bank isn't going to be the hook for all of the fees, because they have no other interest other than just getting their money back. However, if you're taking money from someone else who really is just using you as a straw man or a proxy for a fight they want to fight otherwise, they might be held liable for costs. A lot of it depends on the exact details. However, Moira Deeming has now named several other Liberal Party members and former premiers as backers of the case who might now be liable for costs. These include people like Jeff Kennett, Ted Baillieu, and Dennis Napthine. These are former Liberal Party leaders in Victoria. But it's not just them. There are various other members of Liberal Party that had somewhat supported the case, but have now been potentially liable for even more costs. Now, Jeff Kennett, for his part, said, "I have no worries about it, because my army training taught me you salute the uniform and support the leader. So when John Pizzuto was under pressure, very early, I made a token donation as a public gesture of supporting the leader. After that, I had no idea or involvement in the conduct of the court case. It was a token donation. Now, the court is going to need to determine whether Jeff Kennett, as a former leader and presumably still a current member of the Liberal Party, really had an actual interest in John Pizzuto fighting this case and therefore would need to be held liable. That obviously is something that the court is going to need to examine. However, there's a few things that really need to be unpackaged here. For example, he's saying, as part of my army training, you salute the uniform and support the leader. Well, if the leader is hypothetically doing something illegal, then you don't necessarily just support the leader, because just following orders is not an excuse for, well, for example, to continue our hypothetical for things like war crimes. Now, of course, the analogy does break down a little bit, but you get the idea. You don't support someone even if they happen to be wrong. Rather, I think it would have been better advice to try to counsel John Pizzuto off the ledge to just settle the case and let the whole thing go by the wayside. It would have been much less of a disaster, much less stressful, much less costly. Because now it looks like there's some $5 million in total costs for both parties that could have easily been avoided. For Moira Deeming's part, she stated, each of the above persons has a sufficient connection with Mr. Pizzuto and the proceedings to enable the court to make a non-party costs order against them. And the letter that she sent out also states that they, quote, had an interest in the proceedings, whether financial or otherwise, and our client believes took an active part in the conduct of the proceedings. Again, whether or not that's true is going to turn on what emerges at court. I suspect that a number of these donors probably just did put in some money and they were doing it as perhaps a friend to John Pizzuto. And if you're just donating money to a friend who happens to be running a court case, that's very unlikely, without more, to result in the cost order being held against you. However, if, for example, you happen to be a former leader or a prospective leader of the Liberal Party and you wanted to perhaps use John Pizzuto to get at Moira Deeming, and I'm not alleging that anyone necessarily was doing that, but if that were the case, then they could be held liable for the costs. It really depends on exactly what the nature of their donation was and whether they had any involvement in the case at all. I'd also suggest that if someone had donated some money to John Pizzuto, but then it subsequently emerged that they were counseling him all the time to settle this case and just get it over and done with and to apologize, then there would be a different situation from someone who is donating to John Pizzuto and encouraging him to go to court. Again, this will depend on what the court ultimately finds. The Australian, of course, has described this as a, quote, extraordinary implosion, which I guess to some extent it is. This whole thing could have been avoided and was unnecessary. It appeared that John Pizzuto wanted to make an example of Moira Deeming when he really didn't need to do so. But of course, let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below. I don't have a particular view on Moira Deeming per se. After all, I don't particularly know her policy acumen, and she may or may not be a good member of parliament. However, John Pizzuto could have avoided this whole dumpster fire. But again, let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below.